So, as you've heard, we've got a big program today, and I am so thrilled that we have the opportunity to have this conversation. So, introducing and moderating our main program today is the incomparable Faith Ireland. Faith joined Seattle Rotary 35 years ago. The first month, our club allowed women to join. Faith is a Seattle native and University of Washington graduate. She is a retired Washington State Supreme Court Justice and currently works in alternative dispute resolution. She is a passionate advocate and an inspiration to many through her ongoing leadership. Please welcome Faith Ireland.
Good afternoon. I'm really pleased to briefly introduce two amazing women to you. Leah Rutman, to my immediate left, is Healthcare and Liberty Counsel at the ACLU of Washington. She works on healthcare issues related to health equality, equity, reproductive rights, end of care, and gender life. Prior to joining the ACLU in 2013, Leah practiced with an international law firm in commercial litigation and worked and volunteered at various human rights organizations. Leah is a graduate of McGill University and Columbia University School of Law. She will give you a 5-minute history of abortion rights in the last 100 years and a brief description of what the Dobbs case actually says. To my far left, Congresswoman Schrier is representative for Washington's 8th Congressional District. She is the first and only pediatrician in Congress, and prior to serving the 8th District in the other Washington, she served families in the Issaquah area as a pediatrician for 17 years. She says that she is the only pro-choice woman doctor in all of Congress, and she is a fierce defender of women's reproductive rights, and is the only pro-choice candidate in her race for re-election this year. She will protect a woman's right to choose. In Congress, she sits on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which oversees healthcare. I wouldn't have got that, but apparently it does. And also energy policy. And she's the only member from the Pacific Northwest on the Agriculture Committee, especially important for her East Side constituents. So I'm going to ask Leah Rutman to come up first, and then Leah, when you're done, our Congresswoman will come up, and then at the end, our Congresswoman will ask for Q&A for both of the parties. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here with all of you today and talking about this very relevant issue. Abortion has existed in America since the country's founding and has gone through various phases of legality and illegality, tied largely to historical circumstances and political headwinds. Abortion was generally permitted at the founding of this country, became largely illegal starting in the mid-1800s, and then around the 1960s, states began reforming their strict anti-abortion policies, which of course led up to 1973 with the Roe versus Wade decision, which determined that there was a fundamental right to abortion up to viability across the country. And this was the law of the land until this past June. It is critical to understand when we talk about criminalizing abortion that historically this has not stopped abortions from occurring. Rather, it has made abortion much less safe, compelling pregnant people to risk their health and lives. Estimates of the number of illegal abortions that took place between the 1950s and 1960s range from 200,000 to 1.2 million. And while legal abortion has been shown to be very safe, in 1965, 17% of all deaths attributed to pregnancy and childbirth were attributed to illegal abortions. And criminalizing abortion in a state has largely meant making abortion illegal for some, but not for others. People with means can often pay to travel or obtain the care they need. But criminalizing abortion has had a disproportionate negative impact on people of color, people with fewer resources, younger people, and undocumented immigrants. And that leads us to 1973 and Roe versus Wade, which firmly established abortion as a fundamental constitutional right, legalizing abortion prior to viability across the country. And following Supreme Court cases further reaffirmed this right. However, over the last 50 years, abortion has been legal, but not necessarily accessible. With some states like Washington, which has worked to remove barriers to access, and many other states across our country that have created further barriers. These have looked like refusing to provide insurance coverage for abortions, mandating waiting periods before accessing abortion, or requiring state-based counseling. As such, since the Roe decision, abortion has been legal, but access has certainly not been equitable. And that brings us to Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, the case that was decided in June that overturned Roe versus Wade, allowing states across the country to criminalize abortion. Now, the U.S. Constitution has never explicitly said, you have a right to an abortion. It's just not in there. Shockingly, the founders did not think to include that language. Rather, like with many other rights in the Constitution, this right was found, and it was found within the 14th Amendment. And in Dobbs, the court decided that if something isn't explicitly stated in the Constitution, it cannot exist unless it's deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. And it went on to determine that the abortion right failed this test, and it overturned Roe. Now, there is a lot of ongoing discussion, and we could spend many, many hours talking about the legal reasoning in that decision. The one thing I just want to call out today, and the dissent did it as well in the case, that in looking at reproductive rights, the history and tradition the court was looking at was largely written and executed by men. Just think about that. One thing we do know is that this decision is radical. It takes away Americans' rights, and it is intrinsically tied to other liberty rights to make personal decisions. There are immediate and long-term implications on the ground. I believe 10 states have already banned abortion. Additional states have bans in the works. And it is estimated that Washington state will see an up to 385% increase in individuals seeking abortion care here. One theme that resonated in both Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, another very well-known abortion case, was that the right to control our own reproductive decisions is tied to the ability, and I quote, to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation. This was true in 1973 and continues to be true today. Reproductive rights are intrinsically connected to health, education, jobs, and economic well-being. And as the country becomes a patchwork of states that allow abortion and states that criminalize it, we begin to see a deepening of disparities and inequities. In Washington state, abortion remains legal. The Reproductive Privacy Act, passed by voter initiative in 1991, creates the fundamental right to choose or refuse an abortion. And I'm glad to be here with all of you today as the country and our state charts a new course when it comes to access to abortion and basic health care. Thank you.
Already knocking things down and making all kinds of noises. We both looked at each other when we got up on those chairs and felt like we were going to fall down. We both have a little bit of fear of heights. Leah, that was an amazing introduction, and I think you encapsulated so much of what is at stake here so well. So I want to thank you for that background. And in fact, maybe you can clarify for me afterwards in the Q&A. Maybe I'll ask you the first question, but I believe that it was male doctors who had a whole heck of a lot to do with the fact that abortion became illegal because they didn't want women providers to be offering those services to other women. And that was the AMA in its early days. I don't know that I can apologize for them as a doctor. I'll just, they have corrected themselves. Rotarians, I'm thrilled to be here. I love Rotarians. I walked in at the moment when you were singing It's a Wonderful World, and I love that song. And as I was walking in, I was thinking, yes, and we have to make it better. And as I was thinking about all of this, I was thinking, well, what we're talking about right now is a really big threat to how wonderful a world it is for women and for the people who love women out there. Because this Dobbs decision, as you know from my TV commercials, has me absolutely outraged. This is a right to our own autonomy, to chart the course of our lives, to decide if and when and with whom and under what circumstances to have a child. And it's a right that we have had and assumed we've had for 50 years. And I think about that, and I think about It's a Wonderful World, and I think about girls today who now have fewer rights than their mothers and their grandmothers. And that is shocking to me. In fact, that was one of the first things that we talked about on the floor of the House when one of my colleagues had her nieces there. And it struck us at what a catastrophe really this is for women. It is also incredibly unpopular. Like the vast majority, not just the majority, like we're talking 75, 80% of Americans do not believe that Roe should have been overturned. They understand that this is a fundamental right. They understand that sometimes birth control fails, that women need to choose when to have a child, that things can go wrong in a pregnancy, and that this has to be a fundamental right, and that it is part of healthcare. It's not just part of healthcare. Like, it is healthcare, and women are half the population. And so this is alarming to me as a doctor from a medical standpoint for so many reasons. I've been in the room in all kinds of different circumstances. I've been in the room with teenagers who are pregnant and have to make a decision. And I don't think any mother of a teenager out there would dream that her child would become pregnant. And it needs to be her decision, that teenager's decision, about what to do. I've also been in the room with a mom of a toddler so excited about her pregnancy, who then finds out that something is devastatingly wrong with the fetus. And she has to make a decision. And the thing is, it has to be her decision. And I would not judge either of those, girls, women, for what decision they make, but it has to be theirs in consultation with their doctor. And that is what this decision is taking away from women. It is that ability to make that decision, and it's putting it in the hands of politicians, God forbid. I still consider myself a pediatrician, not a politician. I'll just throw it out there. But to put that kind of decision that is so personal and that is a healthcare decision in the hands of the government is just plain scary. And I think that this decision that we just saw in Kansas really paints that picture, that the way that they presented the argument against this change in Kansas that would have undermined their state constitution was to say the last thing we need is another government mandate. And that is exactly what this is, that if you have a state that is a Republican state intent on taking this right away, it is a mandate to women that they must carry a pregnancy to term with either no exceptions or few exceptions. And I am way off my notes here because I can talk about this all day. I wanted to kind of paint a picture because, Leah, you talked about Washington State and how we're fine here. Well, I'm looking at my race a little differently. I'm the only pro-choice woman doctor in all of Congress. I take that position very seriously, and I've seen how necessary it is. In fact, the chairman of Energy and Commerce, which, by the way, has jurisdiction over everything, energy, like everything we want it to have jurisdiction over, it has jurisdiction over. So it has healthcare jurisdiction. And the chairman, Frank Pallone, came to me recently and said, Kim, I am so glad you're on this committee right now, because before, all the doctors were Republican doctors. And so we just had to take their word for what they were saying. And let me tell you the crazy stuff they're saying in there. Like, they will not, only 8 Republicans in all of Congress voted for a simple bill to say that contraception and contraceptives are legal for women to use and that it is legal for doctors to prescribe them. Can you imagine only 8 Republican members of Congress voting for that? That's not in a committee, that is in the entire Congress. And so they're drawing these falsehoods and they're painting these pictures and they're talking, you hear it, you hear the rhetoric about, abortions days before birth. Like, that is just not a thing. They are lying. And so they finally have me on committee to call them on those lies. And it's about time. I am pulled into committees that I'm not even a part of so that I can make this case and be the staunch defender of a woman's right to make her own healthcare decisions. And so I am thrilled to be here today. I also want to note, as you mentioned, that this puts doctors in a very gray area. A doctor who is in Texas right now has a woman in the process of miscarrying, has to get on the phone with the ethics board and her lawyer to know at what point she can do an abortion to end that non-viable in-process miscarriage. We shouldn't have the government in the room. We also should not need to have lawyers in the room. If we're going to trust women to be doctors for our children, to be mothers for our children, to raise our children, then we sure as heck ought to be able to trust women to make this very personal healthcare decision. So I will conclude my comments, and then I think I come over there to take questions. We're going to take some questions, and who's moderating? Okay. Excellent. Thank you, Lillian.
Here we go. Thank you. Thank you for your words, both of you. Makes me kind of want to lose my lunch, but here we go.
Thank you. I'd like to know, Representative Schrier, what you think of, and Leah, your opinion as well, as some have said that maybe we need the Equal Rights Amendment again. Would that make any difference to try for it?
First, we definitely need the Equal Rights Amendment, and we have the states necessary to ratify it. And I'm not a lawyer, but it is time to just get that passed, for sure. But we need to do other things too. I mean, first, we need to hold on to our Democratic majority in Congress, and we need to have a bigger pro-choice majority in the Senate. Because we passed through the House the Women's Health Protection Act that would make Roe the law of the land. We need a Senate to help make that law because we have a president that will sign it into law. So that is 2 big goals for this year. Yeah, and I will leave it at that. 2 things we need.
I have a question. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say I can be the legal backup in agreeing with all of that and just saying we are doing so much on the state level, and it is so hard when on the federal level it is so difficult to move things forward because of the Senate.
I have a question before I come to you. We are lucky to live in Western Washington that is very much a blue bubble. What do you advise us to do to influence the rest of the country that is not so blue?
I think I started on this thought, but I didn't finish it, that we are safe here in Washington state. I'm still puzzling over the number that we're going to have 4 times as many abortions in this state when the states that are outlawing it are so much less populous. But anyway, I haven't done the math on that, but there's a big influx. But here's the thing, we're not safe forever, right? If we lose the House and if we lose the Senate, we don't have a pro-choice majority in the Senate, there's already talk about a national ban on abortion that would hit us right here in Washington state. And for anybody out there who is not listening to that seriously, I think you need to listen seriously because we're seeing it happen all across the country, that there is extremism out there, that our system of districting slants our elections, and politicians are choosing who votes for them instead of voters choosing the people. And that is taking away fundamental rights. And I would not be surprised to see efforts to pass a national ban should we lose those.
So, but tangibly, how do we influence a vote that's not in our, I can't vote for somebody who's in that. What do we do?
Well, I will answer sort of the first part of that question of what we can do for around the country. And I think Representative Schrier was getting at this earlier. You know, providers and patients are scared right now and don't know where to access care. And I think that is a huge role Washington will need to be playing, not only in providing the care that we currently provide, but expanding access and providing protections for providers, patients, and helpers on the ground so that people from other states have the ability to come here to get basic health care when they need it. I think that's something really important, and to be working on the state level to advocate for the laws that we need here to make that a reality.
And as far as other states, which I think you were kind of alluding to, like how do we hold the House? How do we get a pro-choice majority in the Senate? I will let you all look at races across the country that are these toss-up races that are like my race. And you can get involved. You can send postcards, you can donate, you can call your friends in those states and have them get involved. That we all have a role to play in making sure we have representation that represents us.
Thank you both for being here. I was going to say, taking out the extremes on both sides of this issue, it seems for the bulk of individuals, the kind of the ambiguity or the slippery slope is the issue of viability. And I'm just curious what both of you, how you would both address that question. Thanks.
So I'll speak as a doctor here. I think, viability is even a question, right? And do you know that by 20 weeks or 22 weeks or 24 weeks? Because you can find out that a fetus is not viable fairly late in pregnancy. And that's why I think, Roe was really done ideally, like no questions asked until viability. And then after that, you leave it to a woman and her doctor because, something like 1% of abortions happen late in pregnancy. They are always extreme and heartbreaking circumstances that the government should not be involved in. And so this is what I mean when I say, like, the other side is spinning this as an extreme position. It is a position where the government should not be deciding for a woman who is carrying a non-viable pregnancy or a devastating genetic disorder, whether that baby should come to term or not. You don't look satisfied with that answer.
My question was the defining of a traditional pregnancy, when viability, what's the time frame? I think that's the slippery slope for many, the bulk of people.
Yeah, I think the question is, like, when is viability? It used to be thought of as 24 weeks. Is it 22 weeks? Where is viability? And I think that's shifting, and I think that putting a week number is probably not the way to do it. It is to put it with the healthcare professional, with the doctor, who can advise as to whether that pregnancy is a viable pregnancy. Putting a number of weeks on it is a little bit arbitrary, and that's even coming from a pediatrician who's worked in a NICU.
Hi, I'd like to expand the implications of this to maternal health care. We already have problems in this country with maternal health care. I think mortality is like 24 per 100,000 versus the highest in Europe, I believe, is the UK at 9. What implications does this issue have for maternal health care and mortality rates, and what can we do about that?
You really read my mind here. As I was putting together talking points for today, I was like, should I include something maternal mortality? And in the 5 minutes I had, there wasn't time, but it's an incredibly important aspect of this, because at the end of the day, when you ban abortion, you're forcing pregnancy. And so you're going to have more pregnancies that occur, and therefore there's potential for more maternal mortality. I believe the recent statistic from the CDC maybe is 760 US deaths or something a year. I'd have to look back on that. And what we know is there are huge disparities when it comes to maternal mortality, especially among the Black population. And so as you are forcing people to stay pregnant, you are putting them at risk. I think one of the main things we can be doing is advocating against bans to abortion, certainly, and also doing everything we can to improve the healthcare system. And I would defer to Representative Schrier as a doctor there, but certainly more needs to be done on the maternal side as well.
100% agree. We passed the Momnibus to address specifically this issue of maternal mortality. And then there's that gray area of maternal morbidity. Like, what happens in the middle? What happens to somebody who I have type 1 diabetes, who has diabetes, and suddenly that impacts her eyes, her heart, whatever else it is? What about somebody with kidney disease and it overburdens the kidneys, and now she went through the pregnancy and she's on dialysis for the rest of her life? Like, there are so many of these cases where it may not be life threat. Like, how do you even define what life-threatening is? But there's that in-between water, which is why government should not be making this decision. It is why it should be between a woman and her doctor, because every woman is different, every pregnancy is different, and it shouldn't be in the hands of the government.
Again, thank you both for being here. This is a tough subject. My wife and I have had some interesting discussions about it. She was adopted. She says, if Roe were in place, she wouldn't be here. So the question is abortion a form, or should it be a form of birth control?
It's a little bit of a loaded question. I mean, I have actually told my mom kind of the opposite. Like, it's a very philosophical conversation to have, and everybody has their own take on this. I told my mom that had she been in a circumstance where it would have been awful and would have ruined her life or would have jeopardized her health or whatever other reason that she could not have had that first pregnancy, like, okay, I wouldn't be here, but at the right time, at the right place, in the right circumstances for her, she would have had another child who would have had a much better opportunity at a good life. And I know it's anecdotal, but it's kind of it's like the opposite side of the same anecdote. And that's why, again, there will still be pregnancies, there will still be adoptions. It just has to be the woman's choice of whether to carry that pregnancy or not. I don't know if I expressed that quite well.
So your position is that abortion is a form of birth control?
No, I don't think abortion's a form of birth control. I just think the forms of birth control that we have are not perfect. And if they're not perfect, and if you don't know and you cannot take emergency contraception in time, then you can end up in a situation with an unplanned pregnancy. And this is a way to let a woman chart the rest of her life.
And I guess as we think through this, if we start trying to create lines, if the government starts to create lines, or lawyers start to create lines of this is where it's okay for you based on your subjective opinions and my subjective opinions, we end up in a really complicated and problematic place. At the end of the day, it is best to leave these decisions to the people who are individually experiencing them. And so you have one experience, you have one experience, and you should both be able to live those experiences. And by leaving this option open to individuals, that's what we allow.
A question back here.
I've read that the states that are very eager to pass the abortion bans are also the least likely to provide support and services for women and children. Can you speak to that a little bit?
So yes, I think we have all read about that. We have all heard about that. And I think that goes back to the maternal mortality questions. I think that goes back to questions about adoption. And what does it mean if we are pro this or pro that when it comes to ensuring that there are the fundamental structures in place to ensure people have access to health care, to ensure people can raise their children? We're talking a lot about reproductive rights today, but there's a reproductive justice movement. And the reproductive justice movement looks beyond just abortion or reproductive health and expands that and looks to issues relating to the ability to raise children in a healthy environment, the ability to get the care you need. And I think a lot of that speaks to that as an incredibly important aspect of this conversation.
I would agree. I mean, if you're really pro-children, then you provide great funding for education, and we passed in the original Build Back Better affordable childcare, universal preschool, WIC, SNAP, other programs to help people raise families. And I think you have to be consistent in your language. And it is absolutely true that it is the states that have not expanded Medicaid and do not provide those kinds of supports. In fact, I believe Alabama talked about beefing up their foster care system, which is not a way to give kids their best shot at life.
A question back here.
This is a question for Leah. I'm reading Justice Thomas's opinion in Dobbs. I read it as sort of an invitation to bring similar cases to challenge all kinds of rights that are based on privacy decisions from the 60s and 70s. And the way I read it, it could roll back everything from interracial marriage and gay marriage to the right to contraception, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, am I right to be alarmed about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is yes, of course you're right to be alarmed. Justice Thomas did not hold back. And I will say the majority opinion tried to make it clear that they were distinguishing somehow from abortion from all these other rights. When we're talking to same-sex marriage, when we're talking to the right to engage in intimate relationships, Justice Thomas sort of called a spade here and said, if we're doing this, we can go back and look at all these other rights and reconsider them. And he recommended doing that. I think that should scare all of us.
And by the way, if you're wondering why we had to pass a bill in the House to make it the law of the land that you can access contraception and doctors can prescribe it, it is because of that fear. We also passed a bill codifying into law marriage equality for that reason. And we also passed a bill saying that, yes, you can travel across state lines to access health care. It's absurd that we even have to pass these laws, but now we do.
And thank you for doing that.
Leah, this question is probably more for you. With the companies who have stepped up in states to say, we will cover transportation costs or other costs necessary for their employees, how does that, what are the ramifications if their employees are in a state that is banning abortion? You know, what are the legal ramifications for those companies?
It's a great question, and the answer sadly is it's complicated. There have been efforts already to go after employers. I think it's in Texas at least relating to this, and it's going to be an ongoing battle. So, I would say if you are trying to take your state law and apply it in other states, you have pretty good arguments you can't do that, right? But it does get more complicated when someone is existing in that state and providing it. And so I think we're going to have to see that played out in the legal arena. I think there's going to be a lot of energy around defending individuals who are put in lawsuits based on their desire, or corporations who try to assist patients monetarily or otherwise. But I think we're going to have to see how this plays out.
And of course, for all of the great intentions, can I see a show of hands of which women in this room would want to tell their employer if they need to go to another state for an abortion? Yeah, nobody.
If the decision is left up to the individual states, how many states are like Kansas, where the decision will be made by the people as opposed to the legislature?
So what I can say is it really depends, because the reason it was left to the people in Kansas, when you're dealing with a constitutional amendment, there's often a process you have to go through. In Washington state, we established a fundamental right to abortion through an initiative, so it also went to the people, but it was through statute. So it really depends on, are they trying to do it through statute, and can they just do it through the legislature? Are they trying through a constitutional amendment and therefore will go through the people? So it isn't clear yet how many states and which directions they'll go.
Final question over here.
To try and end on a more optimistic note, Representative Schrier, you've been noted for being able to reach across the aisle and work with the other side on complex issues. Have you found some success on this front, and what else can be done to try and work collectively for the common good on this?
That's such an interesting question. I have not found bipartisanship on this issue because look at our districts. There's only 30 districts that could swing either way. Otherwise, you're getting outflanked on the left or outflanked on the right. And you cannot win an election if you come towards the center, which is where the vast majority of the people are. I can tell you that when my friend Dusty Johnson brought up an issue in the Education Committee a couple years ago, and said, I'd like to put an amendment that at any university hospital, a baby born alive must be kept alive, or something. Like, he was put up to it. I could tell by the look on his face and his voice that his heart was not in that, and I had to pound him afterwards, and I felt bad about it because he's a buddy. It's really hard to find the partners there, and what has happened is some of the OBGYNs in Congress are now tap dancing a little bit and saying that that like a DNC for a miscarriage, oh no, that's not an abortion. They're like changing the definitions so that they don't have to break with their party. So unfortunately, it shouldn't be a partisan issue. You know, Republican women get abortions too. This should not be a partisan issue, and unfortunately it is.
Quick question off of Zoom. What do you think is the underlying political agenda of the right wing in curtailing human rights? I just asked the questions. I didn't form the question.
You would have to ask them.
Okay, so while I have the mic, now this is my question. I don't hear anybody talking about religion. It feels like this entire thing is all about religion. All of it. And as a caveat, I got a 17-year-old that is so mad that I'm going to get her Australian citizenship. She's so done with this country because of this entire argument. A 17-year-old. That's the next voter. So done with this. Like, Trump was nothing in comparison to this. Viscerally upset. Get me out of this godforsaken country. I just wanted to add that because that's shocking to me as a dad. Anyway, doesn't it seem like this entire thing is all about religion?
You know, I think it's a great question. Religion comes up often in this conversation. I would say people can have lots of different reasons that they are opposed or supportive of the abortion question. We see, even in Washington state, that there are health systems controlled by religious entities that refuse to provide abortion services. And this, to Rep. Schrier's point, has really come up a lot in the miscarriage management, ectopic pregnancy situations. So religion can certainly play a significant role in this, but I wouldn't say this is all about religion. I think there's a lot of politics involved, and I think there's a lot of just feelings and emotions involved in this. And it's become such a highly politicized issue that at least I believe that some people who might not even be opposed to it are just opposed to it because of party line. And Rep. Schrier could speak to that far better than I could, I'm sure. Okay, I can answer that quickly. I think that's a really good point that you mentioned, in that there are, the question was, doesn't this also have a lot to do about race? And I can say to that when we were talking about the history of abortion earlier, and Rep. Schrier brought up the really good point about the American Medical Association, and that is what led to abortion in many ways being criminalized in the mid-1800s. Another thing that we didn't talk about there is a lot of this had to do with white men being concerned when immigrants were coming into the country and wanting to maintain the majority. And there's a lot that's been written about that and how abortion also relates so much to that. There's a long history of racism when it comes to banning abortion in this country.
I just got the sign that we're supposed to wrap up, but I wanted to address the religion question as a Jewish woman. That this question of when life begins, the definition that is being thrown around in the Republican Party, which is at conception, that is a religious answer to that question. And that in my religious tradition, that is, I mean, I'm a doctor, I don't follow religion, I just want to just throw it out there. That's like until birth. And so I just, again, want to take this decision away from the government, and everybody can have their own philosophical, scientific, religious understanding of this issue, which is very nuanced and very complicated and very personal. But I can tell you that there is a religious freedom element here, that Muslims and Jews both believe the same, that this has to do with viability.
Wow. First, Faith, thank you for bringing this program to us today. And Representative Schrier and Leah Rutman, thank you so much for sharing your insights and the facts that we need on this important topic. I'm also really grateful to this club for its willingness to engage in these conversations. Dr. Schrier and Leah, in recognition of your generosity of time, Seattle 4 has contributed to Harvest Against Hunger, which provides healthy meal components to food banks. 600 servings of healthy produce have been given in your name. We appreciate that. And thank you, Lillian and Ken, for fielding questions from our members. We appreciate you as well. Now, our club, as you know, greatly benefits from the sponsorship of several members, and I'd like to express my gratitude to our gold sponsors, Liz Powell of RE/MAX on Market, and Bob Alexander. We also have other sponsors, Joel Farrell from Morgan Stanley, Dominic Musafia, Seattle Divorce Options, Jacobson Jarvis Certified Public Accountants, Matt Ratlin, NetTech Pro Bono IT Services, and Live Oak AV.